He thought they were just dirty men with shovels. But what rose from that dust-covered camp would shake the foundation of a continent forever. And that morning, as the wind carried the sound of hammers and shouting across the fields, no one knew they were witnessing the birth of something unstoppable. Australia was still young, raw, and crawling toward its own identity, and in the heart of Ballarat, under the scorching goldfields, thousands of miners labored with broken backs and blistered hands, digging into dry earth, not just for gold, but for a way out of poverty and oppression. Men came from Ireland, China, England, Germany, and beyond, drawn by stories of sudden riches, but what they found was far from a dream. The government forced them to buy licenses just for the right to dig, and even if their pans came up empty, they still had to pay. Soldiers stormed their tents without warning, demanding papers, dragging men to jail or beating them into submission, and all of it was legal. The license hunts became more violent and more frequent. Some miners were chased through the fields, others tied up in front of their wives and children for the shame of unpaid fees. The law did not protect them. It preyed on them, and the anger boiled beneath the surface for months. The fires of rebellion lit quietly. One story at a time, a friend jailed a brother, beaten, a family starved. Peter Lalor was among them, an Irish immigrant who had fled British rule only to find the same cruelty in a different uniform. He was no soldier, but he had conviction, he had a voice, and when he spoke, others listened. He watched his fellow miners being treated like animals on land that offered no rights, only rules, and his heart hardened. He began to speak not with rage, but with purpose, gathering miners under the open sky and telling them they were not powerless, that they had a choice to kneel or to stand. What if they refused the licenses? What if they built something together? A wall, not just of wood, but of unity. What if, for once, the powerful were made to answer to the people? The words were like fire, and the spark caught fast. From every corner of the goldfields they came to Bakery Hill, and they came not with greed or hatred, but with something deeper, hope and desperation. They raised a new flag, one no empire had flown before, stitched with stars of the Southern Cross. It was not just cloth, it was a promise. They swore beneath it to defend their rights to the death. Not because they wanted war, but because peace had been denied to them. The government saw the gathering storm and called it treason. They sent more troops, planned more arrests, determined to crush the rising voices before they could grow louder. But it was too late. The miners began to build a stockade at Eureka Diggings, a crude fortress of timber and resolve. It was not grand, but it was sacred, because it was built with belief. Every plank driven into the earth was a declaration: we are not property. We are people. They trained by torchlight with hunting rifles and farming tools, not because they believed they could win, but because they could no longer live as they were. On that final night before the storm, Peter Lalor stood at the edge of the stockade, surrounded by tired hands and defiant faces, and he told them the truth. We may not survive, but our courage will echo longer than our breath. And as they lowered their heads beneath the flag, the Southern Cross watched over them, silent, cold, eternal. Knowing that history was about to be written, not in ink, but in blood. The wind was sharp that night, cutting through the tents and makeshift cabins like a warning from the dark, and though the fires still burned, the camp was quiet. Too quiet for a place that held the weight of hundreds of restless hearts. The stockade stood unfinished, but it was more than just a wall. It was a message, and the men behind it knew the morning could bring death. They held rifles, shovels, sticks, anything that could be swung in desperation, and their eyes told stories of homes left behind, wives waiting in distant towns, children born to fathers who may never return. This was not a battlefield, but it was becoming one, and in the center stood Peter Lalor. Not a general, but a man who had simply refused to stay silent. He walked among them, silently nodding, giving a look or a word of calm, his wounded arm still aching from the strain of hammering timber into the ground. The stars above flickered cold and bright, and the flag of the Southern Cross waved with defiance above their heads. They knew the soldiers would come, they just did not know when or how, and every sound of horses in the distance, every whisper in the trees made them flinch. They were miners, not warriors, but suffering had taught them how to endure, and unity had taught them how to resist. The men were not alone in their vigil. Women and children waited in the shadows, some offering water, some helping bind wounds, others just watching with wide, unblinking eyes. It was not the tools that gave them strength, it was the cause, and they held on to that as if it were armor. The local newspapers had begun to turn their gaze toward Ballarat, some writing stories of violent rebels, others painting them as brave men pushed too far, and the people beyond the goldfields were starting to listen. Some shopkeepers refused to serve the soldiers, sympathizing with the diggers. Others donated food tools, blankets, knowing full well it might be used in rebellion. The town was dividing between silence and solidarity, and the government felt it. The authorities met behind closed doors, whispering fears of a colony slipping from their grip, and they decided to act fast. They would strike hard at dawn and break the stockade before it became a symbol too big to destroy. They assembled more than 100 soldiers, trained, disciplined, armed with bayonets and orders to crush the resistance without mercy. They believed it would be a short operation, one that would send a clear message to every miner in Victoria. That night, as Lalor sat with a group of men by a fading fire, someone handed him a flask, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He did not drink it. He just stared into the flames and whispered, "They are coming, and when they do, we must show them what we are made of." There was no reply, only nods and the crackle of burning wood. In the final hours before dawn, some men wrote letters, others cleaned their rifles or simply held on to the hands of those beside them. Some prayed not for victory but for dignity, so that if they fell, they would fall standing as free men. The darkness thinned, slowly turning to a pale blue, the kind of color that creeps in before the world remembers to breathe. And then it happened. Boots, metal, commands. The sound of charging hooves and the sharp whistle of military order shattered the silence, and like a wave, the government forces rushed toward the barricade. Their rifles fired in unison and chaos erupted instantly. Smoke and screams filled the air as bullets tore through wood and flesh alike. The miners tried to return fire, but many had no chance. Some stood on barrels to see over the barricade and were cut down where they stood. Others fought hand to hand as soldiers breached the walls and stormed inside. Peter Lalor took a bullet in the arm early in the fight, but refused to fall. He shouted orders, urged the men to hold their ground, even as blood poured from his wound. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes, but in that short time, everything changed. More than 30 miners lay dead, some in the mud, others in each other's arms, and the flag of the Southern Cross was torn from its post, trampled beneath soldier boots. The soldiers took prisoners, beat survivors, and marched them through the streets like trophies, thinking they had crushed the rebellion. But what they had done instead was light a fire that would not die. Lalor was carried away, bleeding unconscious, his arm shattered, and later amputated in hiding, where he was sheltered by those who still believed in the cause. The survivors were taken to Melbourne, charged with high treason, and paraded in shackles as if they were murderers. But the people watching did not see criminals. They saw heroes. What happened next would stun the government and change the nation forever. The courtroom in Melbourne was packed shoulder to shoulder as the first of the Eureka rebels was brought forward to face trial. And though the chains around his wrists clanked loudly, it was the silence of the crowd that spoke louder than any protest. The government believed it had silenced the rebellion with bullets and bloodshed, but what they had done was awaken a public that had never been asked to choose a side until now. The man on trial stood tall, bruised but unbroken, and when the charges of high treason were read, the air seemed to freeze. The judge looked down at him as if expecting fear or regret, but instead found only calm resolve. Outside the court, hundreds stood in the streets, holding signs, chanting and waiting to hear what kind of justice would be served for a man who had demanded nothing more than fairness. The trial was not about one miner, it was about the soul of the colony, and soon newspapers all across Victoria were reporting not just on the testimony, but on the growing movement of support for the diggers. Lawyers who had once ignored the miners stepped forward to defend them pro bono, arguing not for rebellion, but for humanity. They told the court that these men were not traitors, but victims pushed to the brink by an unfeeling system that taxed the poor and protected the rich. The jury listened not just with ears, but with hearts, and when they returned with a verdict of not guilty, the courtroom erupted into applause and cheers echoing out into the streets like a bell of freedom. The government tried to push forward with the next trial, but the tide had turned. Every single man brought before the court walked out free, and with each acquittal, the power of the Southern Cross grew stronger. People began painting the flag on signs, sewing it onto jackets, carving it into wood, and raising it in places far beyond the diggings. Peter Lalor, hidden away and recovering from the amputation of his arm, watched all of this unfold with tears in his eyes. He had feared that the loss at the stockade would mean the end of the dream. But now he saw something else growing in its place, a new awareness, a call for justice that was spreading faster than any rebellion ever could. The politicians who once scoffed at the diggers were now forced to listen to the people who elected them, and within months, the changes began. The gold license was scrapped, replaced with a more affordable miner's right, which not only reduced the burden of fees, but also gave miners the right to vote. It was more than a change in policy. It was a shift in power, and for the first time the miners had a voice in the laws that governed them. Lalor himself was elected to Parliament, a man who had once built barricades now standing inside the chambers of legislation where real change could be made. His missing arm was not seen as a weakness, but as a badge of honor, a symbol of sacrifice that had opened the door for a better future. The men who had fallen at Eureka were buried with respect. Their graves marked not with sadness, but with pride, and every year people returned to that patch of earth to remember what had happened there and why. The stockade itself was rebuilt in memory, a replica of the rough wooden walls that once stood as a defiant line between power and the people. And though the guns had gone silent, the echoes of their purpose remained. The Battle of Eureka had been short, brutal, and deadly, but its impact was deep and lasting, and it reminded every citizen that sometimes the most important fights are not for gold or land, but for the dignity of being heard and seen as equals. The streets of Melbourne looked different now, lined with posters calling for reform and flags bearing the Southern Cross hanging from balconies like silent protests against the old order. The voice of the miner was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that reached the doors of Parliament and rattled the bones of those who had once ruled without question. Peter Lalor stood among lawmakers in a suit that could not hide the empty sleeve where his arm had once been. And when he spoke, even his opponents listened because they knew he had bled for what he believed in. The miners had won the right to vote, but the victory was more than political. It was cultural. A new chapter in the story of Australia where identity was no longer defined by birth or wealth, but by courage and unity. The newspapers that once called the diggers lawless now praised them as pioneers of democracy, and the Eureka Rebellion became a rallying cry for workers' unions and civil rights advocates who saw in it the first step toward justice for all. The flag that had flown above the stockade was now a national symbol of resistance and dignity, carried at marches, rallies, and protests wherever people demanded to be treated with fairness and respect. Schools began teaching children about Eureka, not as a riot, but as a revolution, not as a failure, but as a moment when ordinary people changed the course of history. Memorials were built where blood had once soaked the earth, and each year citizens gathered to remember the fallen, not with silence, but with songs, speeches, and the raising of that same stitched constellation that had once fluttered defiantly above the wooden barricades. Yet not everyone was ready to embrace the change. Some saw the reforms as threats to their power and pushed back with new laws and tighter controls, hoping to regain what they had lost. But the spirit of Eureka could not be legislated away. It lived in the hearts of workers who now walked taller in factories, on farms, in ports, and in print shops, knowing that they were the reason power had shifted. Peter Lalor remained in politics for many years, and though his views became more conservative over time, he never forgot the oath taken under the stars, the oath that had once united strangers into brothers. Even his critics admitted that without him and the men who stood beside him, the miners would still be voiceless, and the government would still be blind to their suffering. The memory of that December morning when smoke and gunfire had filled the sky was passed down not just through books, but through families whose ancestors had stood behind the barricade, and those stories were not just about violence, but about vision, about how a dream had refused to die. The reforms that followed Eureka laid the foundation for a democratic Australia, and though the road ahead would still hold battles and betrayals, the country had changed forever. The gold rush eventually faded. The diggings grew quiet, and many of the tents turned into towns. But the legacy of those who had dared to resist remained carved into the soul of a nation, forged not by gold, but by grit and sacrifice. Years passed, but the story of the Eureka Stockade remained alive more than just an event. It became a symbol of defiance, courage, and the power of ordinary people to shape the destiny of a nation. The miners who had once been branded as rebels were now remembered as heroes, and the ground where they stood became sacred soil, a place where Australia found its voice. The wooden stockade that had once stood defiantly against the government troops had long since vanished, but its legacy grew stronger, with time etched into history books, memorials, and hearts. Peter Lalor, who had once stood bleeding inside that crude barricade, had now become a respected figure in Parliament. He walked the polished halls of power, with one arm missing, but with a presence that silenced even his critics. The people who had fought beside him, some dead, some alive, were no longer forgotten. They were now honored in speeches, ceremonies, and classrooms. Their sacrifice was not for gold or fame, it was for a principle. The belief that every man, woman, and child deserved to be treated with fairness, that government should serve the people and not rule over them. The flag of the Southern Cross, which had flown high above the Eureka Stockade, now flew proudly across protests, strikes, and political movements. It was no longer just a flag. It was a declaration of unity and resilience, a banner that reminded Australians that their rights had been won not in quiet negotiations, but in moments of fire and courage. Labor unions carried the spirit of Eureka into their demands for better wages, safer working conditions, and fair representation, and they saw in those miners a reflection of their own struggle. In schools, children learned the story not as a rebellion, but as a moment when democracy was born, not in the ballot box, but on a battlefield. The site of the stockade became a place of pilgrimage where people walked slowly, reading the names of the fallen, touching stones, and standing beneath the recreated flag, imagining the fear, the hope, and the resolve that had once filled the air. Peter Lalor continued to serve the people, though his politics shifted with time, and even as debates grew around his later decisions, no one questioned the price he had paid to ignite change. He never forgot the oath taken under the stars, the words spoken not as a threat, but as a promise that lives would be risked, so others might live freer. His speeches in Parliament echoed the pain and pride of Eureka, reminding lawmakers that they sat in chairs built on the backs of those who had dared to resist tyranny. The Eureka Stockade became the foundation upon which modern Australia stood, a reminder that justice must be defended and that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Every generation since has found strength in that story, from suffragettes demanding the right to vote to Indigenous Australians fighting for recognition, to workers in factories and hospitals asking only for respect and fair pay. The flag waved at every protest, every march, every place where the powerful tried to ignore the powerless, and its presence whispered, "Never forget." In Ballarat, The Museum of Australian Democracy at Eureka stood not just as a building, but as a temple to the past where exhibits and artifacts told the tale of men who had once been labeled traitors but had become torchbearers for a new kind of freedom. Tourists stood in silence before the remnants of rifles, boots, and journals, tears in their eyes, as they read letters written by dying miners to their families, messages of love, hope, and belief that something good could come from their sacrifice. The stockade was rebuilt not as a place of war, but as a lesson, as a living classroom, where people touched the rough timber and felt the pulse of rebellion still alive in the grain. And through it all, the Southern Cross hung in the sky, not just above Ballarat, but above a nation that had dared to redefine itself, not with bloodlines, but with bravery. The Eureka Stockade had not just changed laws, it had changed minds. It had turned subjects into citizens. And it had reminded the world that democracy is not given. It is demanded, earned, and defended. The men who fell in that short battle became eternal in the pages of history. Their names whispered in rallies, carved into memorials, and carried in the chants of protesters who centuries later still draw courage from their example. It is not the number of the dead that makes Eureka sacred, but the depth of their cause, the clarity of their vision, and the immovable power of their unity. Today the rebellion lives on in every voice that rises against injustice, in every hand that votes for change, and in every heart that believes that no matter how small the flame, a fire can rise strong enough to shake a nation.